Last week we studied 2 Samuel chapter 15 about how Absalom, who was one of David's sons, attempted to launch a rebellion to dethrone his father David. And tonight we're not going to include the children's classes because a couple of our members are doing some Zoom classes for them, so we're just going to deal with the questions that are on the adult handout. And we're going to study 2 Samuel chapter 16 and talk a little bit about David, of course, after he left Jerusalem and was running away from his son Absalom. And in 2 Samuel chapter 16, beginning in verse 1, it says, "When David was a little past the top of the mountain, there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, 'What do you mean to do with these?' So Ziba said, 'The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who are faint in the wilderness to drink.' Then the king said, 'And where is your master's son?' And Ziba said to the king, 'Indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me.' So the king said to Ziba, 'Here all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours.' And Ziba said, 'I humbly bow before you, that I may find favor in your sight, my lord, O king.'" We're going to start with question number 1 on the handout. And question number 1 says, "Who met David with provisions as he was fleeing from Jerusalem?" And of course, as we just read there, that was Ziba, who was the servant of Mephibosheth. Now, I know in our adult class we haven't been studying the book of 2 Samuel, but we were in the book of 1 Samuel. So some of this background you might not be familiar with just right off the top of your head. And so Mephibosheth was actually the grandson of Saul, the son of Jonathan. Remember that David and Jonathan were very good friends, and Jonathan knew that David was going to become the next king. And because they were such good friends, Jonathan asked David to make a vow that he would show kindness to his household. And so David looked around and tried to find some of Saul's descendants left to show some kindness to. And eventually he comes across Mephibosheth, who is the son of Jonathan. Now, Mephibosheth, the story behind him is, of course, he was lame. He was a crippled man. He couldn't walk in any way. And that was because of something that happened to him when he was 5 years old. Remember that Saul and Jonathan both got killed in the same day in the same battle. And when news of that came back to the house of Saul, one of the servant women immediately picked up Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson, and began running with him, and he fell. And it was because of that fall that he becomes crippled. But Mephibosheth is the descendant of Saul. He's the son of Jonathan. And so here comes Ziba. This was Saul's servant, but David assigns him to Mephibosheth a little later on. He gives Mephibosheth all of Saul's inheritance and all of Saul's family's inheritance. And because Mephibosheth was lame, crippled, he couldn't take care of it. And so David assigned Ziba and his 15 sons and his 20 servants to take care of this land for Mephibosheth. And so this is who we're reading about here. We're reading about Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth that has come to David. And what does he bring? Well, he brings 2 saddled donkeys along with him. He brings 200 loaves of bread. He brings 100 clusters of raisins, and he also brings a skin of wine or grape juice for them to drink. And it seems like his intentions were to try to demonstrate to David his loyalty. You know, that was really the question at this time. Who's loyal to David and who's loyal to Absalom? And so I think he wanted to be sure that David understood, I'm loyal to you, and I brought these 2 donkeys loaded with food for you because of my loyalty. Number 2 is the question, what difference of opinion did Ziba report between himself and Mephibosheth? Now it's interesting, you go back and you read, David asked a couple of questions. In verse 2, he asked the question, what do you mean with these? Or, you know, why did you bring these 2 donkeys and 200 loaves of bread and 100 clusters of raisins and this skin of grape juice for us? And of course, he points out, I brought them for you. I brought the donkeys for your servants or your probably his wives to ride upon. I brought this food for any of your company who's hungry. I brought this drink for anybody of your company who's thirsty. The second question that he asked in verse 3, he said, "Where is your master's son?" In other words, he's asking, where is Mephibosheth? Why didn't he come himself? Why are you bringing this gift to me? Why wouldn't Mephibosheth show up in person and offer me these things? And Ziba told him, well, it's because his loyalty is not with you. He's staying back in Jerusalem because he thinks that in this state of confusion, that maybe the kingdom's going to turn back to Saul's family and he's going to become the next king of Israel. Ziba was an opportunist, and I think what we'll read about him and study about him a little later on, it's pretty obvious to me that he was lying about what Mephibosheth did and why he was in Jerusalem, but we'll talk about that a little later on. You can read about it in chapter 19 and verses 24 through 30. And Mephibosheth, he basically points out to David when he's returned, he hasn't shaved. He's in a state of mourning. It's pretty obvious. He hasn't changed his clothes, hadn't taken a bath since the day that David left Jerusalem. And so it's pretty obvious that his loyalty was to David. And he basically tells David, well, my servant Ziba made this up. He told me not to worry about going. He would go in my stead. And then he made this story up about how I was trying to get the kingdom back or get it back to the family of Saul. But you do have to give Ziba a little bit of credit because he was one of the few people who believed that Absalom's attempts were going to fail. And I'd like to say that he brought these provisions to David, out of loyalty and love for David. But I really think it was selfish in motive. He was trying to further benefit himself for positions of greater influence, greater power whenever David ascended back or was restored back to the throne. Number 3, so what was David's response to Ziba's actions? Well, he gave everything that belonged to Mephibosheth to Ziba. That kind of illustrates a principle in that day and age. It was royalty's prerogative to confiscate the land of their enemies and to redistribute it as they saw fit. And so, since Ziba had told David that Mephibosheth was against him, he exercised that prerogative to reconfiscate or to confiscate all of this land and then to redistribute it to Ziba in his stead because he had shown by his actions that he was in fact loyal to David. Number 4 then asks the question, something for us to think about. Why is it not wise to take one person's versions of events at face value without hearing the other side? And it's obviously what we just talked about because that person, could be being deceitful with you. He could be lying about the things that had taken place. And, David, he was obviously in a very difficult time, but usually he's a very patient man. And so I don't know why David didn't immediately think, well, Mephibosheth didn't come because, he's a cripple. He can't walk. And it would have been a tremendous burden on him to have to journey out here by himself. But of course, Ziba stated that Mephibosheth was staying in Jerusalem, and he was hoping during this current state of confusion that was caused by Absalom's rebellion that the people might try to give the throne back to his grandfather Saul, or at least to his family. And that's not improbable. But it really was inconceivable. Well, it's not inconceivable, rather, but it was improbable. When the people started looking for order, it could have very well be that Saul's loyalists used that opportunity to seize the throne or to seize that action and to take over the throne itself. But David believed it. He believed it hastily. He reacted very rashly, which was kind of out of character. And he immediately decrees that all the land of Mephibosheth, all that he had given to him, was now going to be turned over into the hands of Ziba. I can understand a little bit why he'd do so. The revolt was so widespread. Loyalties were so shaken. In fact, if you you think about it, David's own son, Absalom, had turned against him. One of his closest friends and one of his most loyal advisors, Ahithophel, had turned against him. And so the idea that Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, had turned against him too wasn't probably that far-fetched in David's mind. Let's go down to verse 5 of 2 Samuel 16. Now when King David came to Bahurim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, coming from there. He came out cursing continuously as he came. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man. Then Abishai the son of Zeruiah said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head. But the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, curse David. Who then shall say, why have you done so? All right, if you look at number 5 on your sheet, the question is, what did Shimei, son of Gera, do when David's following passed his way? Well, we just read how he cursed him and he threw stones at him. We might think, well, why didn't David, immediately put an end to that? Or why didn't one of David's men come out and put an end to that? And if you go down to verse 13, we're going to read it a little later on, but if you look at verse 13, you'll find that Shimei was actually on the side of a hill that was probably overlooking the road. And so from this side of the hill, he was throwing stones, which would probably be downward at David, and he was kicking up dust, which was falling on David and his followers. But he doesn't really seem to be intimidated by the fact that David is surrounded here by his own royal bodyguards, his own personal guards on his right hand and on his left. And so that kind of indicates to me that he felt pretty safe where he was. He probably thought, well, if David sends anybody after me, I'm at an advantage being above them here, and I can get away. I'll see them coming and I can get away before they ever get over here to me. But he evidently thought that he had some means of escape, or else that he wasn't going to get punished for doing this. Number 6, what accusation and curse did Shimei level against David? He calls for David to get out. David was leaving Jerusalem. He calls for him to get out of the city, to be banished, to be exiled. And he called David a couple of things. The first thing that he calls him is a man of blood. And certainly when you study David and his conquest for the army of Saul, David was a very experienced warrior. David was a man who did indeed shed a lot of blood. And he also calls him, the New King James Version calls him a rogue in verse 7, a scoundrel. And it's literally the phrase son of Belial. Some of our adult people will probably remember, some of that, or that phrase from studying the book of 1 Samuel. Whenever Eli thinks that Hannah is drunk, as she's, praying to God, she's moving her lips, but no sound is coming out. And she says, don't count me as a daughter of Belial. Also the sons of Eli. Remember, the Bible says that they were sons of Belial or Belial, which just means a wicked one, a scoundrel, a worthless person. And so David calls him a man of blood. He also calls him a worthless person. And he's basically telling him, you're getting what you deserve. All this is coming upon you because of the blood that you shed in order to get your throne. Number 7, the question is, why was Shimei so bitter against David? Well, if you look back in verse 5, Shimei was a man from the family of the house of Saul. So he was one of Saul's descendants. He believed that David took the kingdom from him, that he actually stole it from him. And so he says, now you're getting what you deserve. You're getting a taste of your own medicine. You stole the kingdom from Saul, and now your son is stealing the kingdom from you. Number 8 asks the question, and this is one for us to think about. As a child of God, who is likely to rejoice if you stumble? Well, when you study David, the ones who rejoiced over his stumbling were those who we would consider his enemies. And the same is true with us too. You know, Shimei Shimei couldn't resist taunting David in this hour of humiliation. He couldn't resist cursing him, trying to lash out against him and cause him more hurt in this difficult time in David's life. And that's something good for us to think about too. You know, what kind of person are we when other people fall into difficult times during their lives? Are we like Shimei? Are we the people who try to heap insults upon them? The people who try to inflict more and more pain? Or are we the people who are going to reach out and to help them and try to sympathize with them? And of course, as Christians, our job is to try to help those during troubled times and to offer our sympathy in any way that we can. Number 9 asks the question, what did Abishai propose to do to Shimei? Well, he asked David's permission to go over there and to cut off his head. Now that might seem a little extreme to us, but a little bit of background on Abishai. Abishai was Joab's brother, and both Joab and, he was a nephew. And so he was related to Joab. He was David's nephew. And so I think that he probably took this wording a little bit personal. You know, the fact that he was attacking his own flesh and his own blood. And he was a man who was extremely loyal to David. And his disgust for Shimei is seen in the fact that he calls him a dead dog. And we've talked about this before. You know, what good is a dead dog? What profit can it bring to anybody? Well, there's nothing useful for a dead dog. You can't profit in any way by it. You can't benefit anybody else in giving them a dead dog. And so basically, you know, he's saying this guy is a worthless, a useless guy. But it's also interesting to take note, there was a divine law in Exodus 22:28. It says, you shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. And so it was indeed a crime. It was a violation of God's law for anybody to curse the ruler of Israel. And here you have a man who's blatantly defying God's law, who is also heaping insults upon David in a very difficult time. And obviously it was a crime, and Abishai was prepared to execute any punishment that was in accordance with that crime. Number 10, the question is, how did David's view of the situation differ radically from Abishai's? Well, David assumes that this cursing of Shimei is actually God's hand at work, God's underlying work that's taking place here. And David sees himself as being chastised by God for 2 reasons. Remember last week we talked about it because he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and he murdered Uriah, her husband, by sending him to the front of the battle and then telling his soldiers, commanding the soldiers to retreat from him. And because of that sin, remember that God said the sword would never depart from the house of David. The family of David, there was always going to be conflict in it, turmoil in it, because of this sin that he committed, adultery, and also the murder of Uriah. And that begins with the death of David and Bathsheba's child. From that relationship that took place, that adultery, there was a child that was conceived in the womb of Bathsheba. That child died. From there, you study about the family of David. David was a man who had many wives, like a lot of the kings did. He had many different children by many different women. And you'll read about a rape that took place within that family, within that, stepbrothers and stepsisters. You'll read about murder that took place there also. The latest is the rebellion of Absalom, his own son, against him. And so David sees all the hand of God in all those things. And as he sees Shimei out here cursing him along the way, he said, hey, this is just part of God's punishment that's coming upon him. And so if God has used him to curse me, then who am I to try to tell you, Abishai, to go over there and cut his head off? Just let him curse, let him fulfill God's correction upon me. And so even as David is running away from the city of Jerusalem, he's seeing the hand of God, God's discipline being exercised against him. Notice verse 11, 2 Samuel 16. And David said to Abishai and all his servants, see how my son who came from my own body seeks my life. how much more then may this Benjamite? Let him alone and let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day." And as David and his men went along the road, Shimei went along the hillside opposite him, and cursed as he went, threw stones at him, and kicked up dust. Now the king and all the people who were with him became weary, so they refreshed themselves there. Question number 11 on the handout is, what order did David give concerning Shimei, and what was his reason for doing so? Well, the order was to leave him alone. And the reason was, as we had just talked about, it was David's feelings, his belief that the Lord had ordered him to do what he was doing. And so he wasn't going to resist the corrective discipline of God. He also points out, my own son is disloyal to me and trying to kill me at this time. Why would I expect loyalty from a descendant of the household or the family of Saul? Number 12, for what outcome did David hope instead of the immediate death of the heckler? Well, he hoped that God would look down upon him during this difficult time, during his enemies cursing him, and would bless him instead. And so we talked about before how David was a very patient man. He was a man who was always willing, usually, to let God do things in his own time. And so here he is, and he's basically saying God's going to take care of it. If we let him curse me, then maybe God will look down upon me and bless me because of this cursing. Number 13 asks this question: how does our belief in God enable us to respond charitably toward our enemies? Well, David was merciful. He didn't give Shimei what he deserved. But our belief in God enables us to act charitably toward our enemies, because the Bible teaches us that revenge belongs to God. It's not my place and it's not your place to punish those who are disobedient to God. I'm not going to be the person in the end, the executioner, the person who punishes everybody for all their wrongdoings. But it is our place, it is my place and your place to love our fellow man and to do whatever is good for them, not only physically speaking, but also spiritually speaking. And of course, we know, like passages in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45 and following, that includes our enemies also. And so that belief in God, and that God is going to be the one who punishes everybody, and it's not our place, and what our role is, that's what allows us, or should allow us, to treat our enemies favorably, just like David did. Number 14, what characteristics or what traits did David exhibit through this reaction to Shimei? Patience, long-suffering, kindness, mercy. All those things are qualities that David exhibited during a very difficult time. Number 15 asks the question: to what critic in your life would you like to learn to respond with silence and faith in God? Now, that's a personal question, so it's going to differ for each of us, but it does bring up the idea that sometimes it's better to respond with what the Bible calls meekness. Meekness is power under control. And so you don't always have to answer somebody who levels accusations against you or who curses you. We don't always have to have a reaction to that. Unfortunately, sometimes we do, but sometimes it's better to respond with meekness than to respond with punishment, as David illustrates in this story. Sometimes it's better to just keep our mouth shut and let God take care of the rest. And David was a man who did that in a lot of difficult situations in his life. Number 16, what did Shimei continue to do as David and his men journeyed on? Well, he continued to throw rocks at them and to kick up that dust, and of course the dirt falling down on top of them. And understand that wasn't meant to inflict any physical pain or injury, but it was really just a way for him to show his hatred that he had for David, and his gladness for seeing that he was getting driven out of the city of Jerusalem. Number 17, what did David do when he arrived at his destination? Well, looking back in verse 14, David and his company rested. And, that's a good thing to think about too, because a lot of times when we get tired, when we grow weary or we're exhausted, it's easy to irritate us more than what it would normally be able, or what a person might be able to accomplish, just through normal actions of a day. Being tired, being exhausted makes us more irritable. And so taking a break, resting, refreshing ourselves, that helps to put things into perspective. That helps to give us a better look out on life and to put us in a more favorable attitude. And that's what David and his company does. Maybe David thought, well, everybody's getting grouchy here. Abishai is wanting to kill this man to take his head off. Maybe we should just take a break and rest. Let's look at verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came back to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. And so it was when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king, long live the king." So Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?" And Hushai said to Absalom, "No, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in your father's presence, so will I be in your presence." Remember Hushai the Archite at the end of chapter 15 here in 2 Samuel. He's the older man who meets David on his journey outside of the city of Jerusalem, actually on the hill outside the city of Jerusalem. And because he was older, David said, "You're not going to be able to travel along with us, to keep up with us. I want you to go back. I want you to be my spy. I want you to help defeat the council of Ahithophel." And so that's who we're reading about here. As Absalom comes into the city, number 18, it says, "Who was at Absalom's side when he entered the city of Jerusalem?" Well, a lot of the men of Israel. Remember, he had 200 men of Israel that he'd taken with him to Hebron. Some of the chief leaders and people of the city came in with him. And also Ahithophel, who was David's former friend, very close friend, and probably his most trusted advisor. In fact, it's believed that David wrote in Psalm 41 and verse 9, "Even my known familiar friend in whom I have trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." Most people believe that was written by David concerning Ahithophel. It's interesting, a little later on, of course, we know that it was prophetically applied to Judas, who betrayed Jesus Christ. But he was a very close friend of David, and he was a very, very good advisor, as we'll learn as we study about him. Number 19, what question did Absalom have for Hushai the Archite when they met? Well, he asked why he hadn't left with David. Being David's friend, why didn't you follow him out? Why didn't you go out of the city with all the rest of his friends? And of course, Hushai greets him with the phrase, "Long life to the king, long life to the king." It's interesting that Hushai doesn't immediately say who he wishes has long life. And so Absalom may be a little bit suspicious here, and he asks, is this how you treat your friends? You're supposed to be a friend of my father David. Is this how you express your friendship, by betraying? Is this how you show your loyalty toward your friends? And if so, I think I can probably do without that kind of friend. Number 20, what reasons did Hushai give to convince Absalom that he would change his loyalties? Well, Hushai said that his loyalties lay with whomever the Lord chose to be king and whomever Israel chose to be king. And so he was basically saying to Absalom here that God has chosen you to be the next king of Israel. The people have chosen you to be the next king of Israel. And so my loyalty is going to be with whoever the Lord chooses and whoever Israel chooses. Notice verse 20 here in chapter 16. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give counsel as to what we should do." And Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the top of the house, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Question number 21, what was Ahithophel's advice on how Absalom should proceed in his bid to become king instead of David? Remember that David left 10 of his wife concubines behind to take care of the palace in his absence. And so Ahithophel's advice was for Absalom to sleep with these concubines, these wives of David that he had left behind. And that would accomplish a couple of things. The first thing that it would accomplish is that he would become a stench in the nostrils of his father. Literally, a stench is what he talks about there, or the wording that he uses. And so it would cause a situation where there was no way that he and his father would ever be reconciled again. And by doing that, not only did it cause that rift between he and his father, but it also reassured all these followers of Absalom that there wasn't going to be any reconciliation, that Absalom was in this, he was putting everything that he had into this. He wasn't going to turn back. After he slept with his father's wife, there wasn't any turning back. And it basically showed that he was the one who was going to try to assert the throne. And it was either going to end in him being punished in prison or him being put to death. And so he was going to fight just as hard as he could to try to make this thing happen. Number 22, the last question: how was Ahithophel regarded as an advisor to the kings? His advice, the Bible says, was regarded as one who had inquired by God, which means basically he always gave good advice. His advice was always right. And God had given him tremendous wisdom, and that's why Absalom follows what he says. As filthy as it was good counsel to a person who was trying to usurp the throne and to reinforce the confidence of his following in him, because it basically made the claim that Absalom, everything that David had, everything, including his wives, now belonged to Absalom. He was now the king of Israel. If you would, let's end tonight with a prayer. Our God and our Father who art in heaven, Lord, we're thankful for this time that we've had to study your word. We're thankful for your Son, Jesus Christ, who came to this earth and lived his life for us as a man and gave it ultimately in death upon that cross. We're thankful for the plan of forgiveness that you've provided for us, for the opportunity that we have to be called your children. We ask that you would bless us as we seek to learn more about you, and that you would allow us to take the things that we've learned here tonight to correctly apply them in our lives and be able to teach them to others also. We ask that you would be with our nation and our world in this very difficult time. Be with those within the medical fields who are treating those who are ill, and we ask that success might be granted to them. And we ask that you would help us, Father, to look at the things that we so often take for granted in our daily lives, and to have a greater appreciation for them, and to give thee the praise and the honor and the glory for them. All these things we pray through the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.